Thank you for joining us on the Miniature Book Channel. Our goal on the Miniature Book Channel is to delve into the history, the development of miniature books from their inception all the way to the producers of today. There are some gorgeous miniature books. There are some miniature books that are literally works of art, and they're all small. I'm your host. I'm Rick Hill, and I've been collecting miniature books for many, many years. I am always asked, how did you get started in miniature books? 1959, yeah, it's a long time ago. But 1959, I was a young boy, and every Thursday, my mother would have my grandmother come over, my great-grandmother, and we would all get in this gigantic 1959 Delta 88 blue Oldsmobile, and we would cruise around town going to antique stores. My mother collected miniature pianos, little tiny pianos. She had hundreds of them, literally hundreds, second only to Liberace. And my grandmother, she collected little snuff boxes, some really beautiful ones from the 1800s and 1700s. And my great grandmother collected Social Security. She just came along for the ride, and I usually would hang around her because, great grandmothers are wonderful. So we're going through this antique store, and my mother goes, "Ricky, what do you think maybe you would like to collect?" And I kind of went, "Well, collect? I never thought of that." And so I looked around the antique store, and to be honest with you, the thing that caught my eye was a Shirley Temple display with a Shirley Temple doll. It was gorgeous. But I thought, uh, all my friends would laugh at me, and I can't do that. And so I went back through the antique store, and we were just about to go. And all of a sudden, I spied this very book. This is William Shakespeare. Has a little leather binding. It's gilt, which means it's gold, and there's a beautiful little crest, and it's in excellent condition. And I opened it up, and it says the Knickerbocker Leather Company. And I thought, I really like this. There's something about this little book that spoke to me. I don't know what it was. So we bought it. And as I recall, the lady wanted 50 cents. My mother talked her down to a quarter because she was buying some other things. So for a quarter, this is my beginning of miniature books. Now, one of the things that I found out about miniature books is that the big book, such as Minding the Store by Stanley Marcus. This is a nice book, but my library is not terribly large. Lo and behold, Stanley Marcus created a miniature book. The exact same thing. On the back is a portrait of Stanley Marcus, and I bought this at Neiman Marcus. Oh, Stanley Marcus was the chairman of Neiman Marcus. And again, lo and behold, a couple of years later, I'm in Neiman Marcus. I buy his big book, Quest for the Best, which is an excellent book. And then I found at Neiman Marcus his miniature book, and I bought it. The neat thing about this one is, as I was purchasing it, Mr. Marcus was there, and he signed it, and he signed this one too. Books in all sizes. This is one of my favorite books. Books in all sizes can be produced as a miniature. This is a book called Miniature Books, very appropriate. I apologize for the way my copy looks, but it's my reference book. And I have two other copies that are pristine. And but this one, it's got Coke on it. It's been torn. But this is my miniature book of it, and I treasure this. Absolutely treasure it. It's exactly the same inside as this book, and so that got me started looking at modern miniature books. Now, my background is journalism. I did newspapers, I did magazines, I did books, and and I taught, and I taught college, university, and I taught high school, and all of my students, every one of them, I would tell them you have to start by answering who, what, where, when, why, and how. Almost forgot how. So that's what we're going to do. Now, I'll be totally frank with you. This is my this is my fifth attempt to make a YouTube video. I ain't an 18-year-old kid anymore. And at my age, technical things can be difficult. And getting everything right in a row seemed nearly impossible, but I think this one is going to go. What I did find out in making my first 5 or 4 videos was that they were too long. And so what I've done is I've cut it into 2 parts. And we're going to do what, when, and how. What, when, and how. So let's get started. All right. What is a miniature book? Well, the easy answer would be it's a little book, Rick, obviously. Well, here's one of my favorite buildings. By the way, I live in the D.C. area, and I am a frequent visitor to the Library of Congress. I'm very proud to say that I hold a reference card, and that I can go to some of the secure areas and ask for absolutely any book be brought to me. So the Library of Congress, many years ago, came out and they said, a miniature book shall be 10 centimeters. And of course, not everybody uses centimeters, so that is 3 15/16 of an inch. Personally, I would have made it 4 inches, but the Library of Congress didn't. The Library of Congress rule is called the simple hand theory. If one can easily carry and read a book in one hand, then it is a miniature book. And quite honestly, I find that to be delightfully simple. Then along comes this fellow. This is Louis Bondy. Louis Bondy had a tremendous life. And one of the things that he did was he codified or solidified miniature books. He wrote a history of miniature books that is basically the definitive book that anyone who collects miniature book has a copy of this. And Louis Bondy, who lived in London, had a bookstore on Little Russell Street, right around the corner from the British Museum. And he said, I think a miniature book should be 3 inches. Well, that became the Bondy rule. Now, this is a copy of his book, Miniature Books. And by the way, if you get interested, you can buy these on eBay. You can get them at many used bookstores, and I highly recommend it. Now, in the United States, the premier group or club, and in this case called a society, is the Miniature Book Society. And they are normally the organization that is quoted when it comes to universities, news reports about miniature books. And they came in and they said, we all agree with Bondy, 3 inches, exclamation point. Well, now there is the rest of the world. Europe and most of the rest of the world, they said, we think a miniature book should be 10.16 centimeters or 4 inches. And of course, the United States said, no, it's 3 inches, period. They were very emphatic about it. Now let's look at the nomenclature or the names of the different sizes of books, because this is basically how miniature books are categorized. First is the macro miniature. Now, I placed a lovely book on a green background, and this green background is divided into inches. So you can count them 1, 2, 3, 4. It's just almost up to 4. And so a macro miniature, so this is a larger than 3-inch book, is above 3 inches. Now, above, not 3 inches, but above 3 inches to 4 inches. And these are two lovely books. One is from Paris, and the other is one of my set of Shakespeare by William Pickering. And I think that was made in 1824, 25, something like that. And what I want you to see as I opened up the first page of the Pickering book is how legible the type is. Because this is the second question that people ask. Can you read a miniature book? Absolutely. They're meant to be functional. Matter of fact, the Pickering book was meant for people who traveled, and they could take a very small pocketbook, literal pocketbook, and take it with them wherever, in a coach ride, and they could read it when they went to people's houses. And I'll show you some traveling cases. They're rather fascinating. Now, this is a miniature copy of the book Miniature Books. It measures right at 3 inches, and so it would be considered the largest of the class designated miniature. The miniature book is supposed to be 2 inches to 3 inches. However, this guy, Julian Edison, he comes up and he says, no, a miniature book is 1 inch to 3 inch. Now, why do I include Julian Edison? Well, number one, he was one of my very best friends. He was my mentor. We worked together publishing a newsletter. And secondly, he and Anne Bromer wrote the book Miniature Books. He also happened to own the largest collection of miniature books in the entire world. And he passed away a couple of years ago, and his widow decided that those books should be housed in his alma mater, Harvard. Okay, let's look. And so I'm going to include both the regular or the normal sizes, and then also Julian Edison's, not necessarily out of respect, but out of, I think Julian probably codified miniature books and did more for miniature books than even Louis Bondi. All right, here's an example of a miniature book. It's not the one that I showed. It's one from 1866, I believe. And it's very legible. I put a penny down there to give you an indication of the size. And the type is very easy to read. Now then, the next one is the micro miniature. And the example that I have is a Hungarian book. Now, Hungary, during the Cold War, when they were behind the Iron Curtain, paper was at a premium. And so in order to learn printing, they would bring their apprentices in, and they would make miniature books. And they became so good at it that they are one of the world's um, most prolific producers of miniature books. The thing I like this one is it has a cloisonne picture glued to the front of the Hungarian king from 1116 to 1172. And I don't read Hungarian, but I wish I knew the name. So micro miniatures are 1 inch to 2 inch, according to Julian Edison. They are smaller than that. They are 1/4 of an inch to 1 inch. And I would tend to agree with that. Um, I also put another miniature book here by Bella Blah. And he was a very, not just famous, but he was probably the finest binder of miniature books in the entire world. This is not that book. This is another book by Mosaic Press in 1978, and this is 17 Haunted Houses. And apparently the White House is haunted. And if you notice the penny, it looks much larger than it did on the other ones. And the text is very easy to read. Very easy. All right, the next one is not my favorite because they're too darn small, and my hands are thick and can't hold them very well. I do have some, but they're hard to display. This would be the Ultra Micro Miniature, which standard is that it's under 1 inch, and then Julian Edison, it's under 1/4 of an inch. And again, I tend to agree with Julian Edison on that. I put down the book from Black Cat Press and Barbara Rahab. Barbara Rahab was the most amazing lady who made these tiny ultra micro miniature books that many dollhouse collectors put in their dollhouse libraries. And this is a book, He Is Nothing But a Little Boy. It's delightful. The second book that I put down there is the one that Julian Edison, the 1/4 of an inch. I do not have, well, I don't, can't show mine right now, but it is the 1953 Waldman and Fichtner Berlin, from Berlin, 2 centimeters or 1/4 of an inch, and it is the Olympic Oath. Now, here's a sample text from He Is Nothing But a Little Boy. It's very easy to read. Even the ultra miniature books are very simple to read. Okay, now I'd like to get into the when of miniature books. I do a lot of research, and in looking at the different universities and people who write about miniature books, I have been utterly astonished how many universities say miniature books started in the 18th century. These people are off by thousands of years. So let's get into the when. The first real miniature books were cuneiform tablets from Mesopotamia, 2200 BCE. In other words, over 4,000 years ago. They are small, under 3 inches, and they were used for everything from contracts to information about cattle to buying things to almost like letters. You would send them from one part of Mesopotamia to another part of Mesopotamia. And from these first cuneiform tablets and up until the advent of the printing press, all manuscripts were written by hand. The manu in manuscript gets its derivation from the Latin for hand, which is manus. I'm going to try something here. Manus Hands of Fate. Yeah, that's a pretty, I bet there's only two people who even catches that. Anyway, the Middle Ages, 476 to 1520, saw some of the most beautiful developments in personal books of devotion. Most popular among all classes was the Book of Hours of the Blessed Virgin Mary. These were their private devotional books, written in Latin. The miniature ones were easy to carry and used for many purposes, such as they were used to teach their children to read Latin. And of course, they were used for taking them to church, and the wealthier people had the more ornate ones. These are some beautiful examples, but of all of them, the one that has always caught my eye is this one. Perhaps the most famous is Anne Boleyn's Gold Book. In 1536, the legend goes that she held that book with her as she ascended to the execution on the scaffold. She handed the book to one of her ladies in waiting. It is now housed safely in the British Museum. Now, the first traditional miniature book was made in 1468. Now, if you're a book lover, you know 1468 is very close to when Johann Gutenberg invented the printing press. Well, this happens to be printed by one of his assistants and his successor in publishing, a guy named Peter Schoeffer. His miniature book no longer exists in extent in a copy, but there are still fragments which exist at the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. Now, from the 16th to the 19th century, religion would always be at the forefront of publishers' mind for the next 300 years. Instructional books about the history of the Bible and tiny stories from the Bible for tiny hands were published in the millions. There were some sterling examples of bookmakers' arts during this time. In 1780, Elizabeth Newberry published the Bible in miniature in London. It was bound in red morocco with ornate gilt decoration. This would be the height of what were called the thumb Bible for children. Now, the reason it's called a thumb Bible is pretty simple, because the books were about the size of an adult's thumb. The most prominent publisher of thumb Bibles was John Taylor, who in 1614 created an easy-to-handle and read Bible for children. 200 years later, they were still being published in England, and some excellent examples still exist today. In the earlier years of printing, any book was highly valued. Even the Bible in a church would be coveted, and they were sometimes stolen. The solution was to chain the Bible to the lectern. To celebrate the 300th anniversary of the King James Version, David Bryson's son in Glasgow created this unique thumb Bible with lectern and chain in 1911. And I'm proud to say that I have this book. After religious education, the next large production of miniature books boomed in the 19th century. Books of moral and educational instruction were printed all across America, England, Europe, and the world. Another popular use of the size to sell miniature books came as people had more time and more money to travel, and they needed a handy dictionary or novel to read. And so these little books came about. In 1820, William Pickering, who I've mentioned before, of London, began publishing books. The second book he published was a miniature book. He was the first publisher to use cloth as a binding material. This afforded a less expensive book and the ability to rebind the book in leather. If you were wealthy, you wanted your books to look like they were made out of gold. And so you would gild them. You would put gold on the outside and you would put it on the spine so it could show. And William Pickering was very smart in making a much less expensive book in order that people could rebind. Now, following the successful publication of these small editions, Jones and Company in 1825 begun printing the Diamond Poets and Classics. The diamond refers to the tiny type used to print the text. They used crushed silk binding for their books and hit upon the idea of creating a traveling case that could hold 53 volumes. This is my traveling case that I acquired several years ago, and it is full. It has all of the original 53 volumes intact. Now, a real renaissance in miniature books came about in America as a result of the demand for excellence in printing, paper, binding, and presentation by one man, and his name was Achilles Saint Onge. His friends called him Archie. Saint Onge's first attempt at producing a miniature book came in 1935 when the Massachusetts native produced Noel. This is the front page of Noel. From there, he produced some of the finest miniature books, and most importantly, he inspired bookmakers across the globe to once again use their skills to make miniature books. St. Onge would use the finest printer in Europe and the finest bookbinder in England to produce his books. He also was not afraid to produce in volume, with many of his runs being over 1,000. His demand for the finest details caught the attention of some of the greatest people in the world. His book on Robert Goddard, the father of space age, caught the attention of Buzz Aldrin, and a copy of that very book, a miniature book, was taken by astronaut Aldrin in the first moon landing. To celebrate the coronation services of Queen Elizabeth II in 1953, St. Onge had 2,000 copies of the service printed on handmade paper and bound at England's most prestigious bindery. He also had a special copy bound and presented to the new queen. And I believe this is one of the most gorgeous books that is in existence. Years later, Robert Kennedy, the brother of John Fitzgerald Kennedy, the president in the early 1960s, took a copy of St. Onge's very popular inaugural speech of John Fitzgerald Kennedy with him when he scaled the newly named Mount Kennedy. Mount Kennedy was named for President Kennedy after he was shot. He left one copy at the top of the mountain in remembrance of his slain brother. When JFK was inaugurated, my mother, once again, she saw an ad for a miniature book from St. Onge of the inaugural address for $2.50, and this became my first contemporary miniature book. I now own all of Archie St. Onge's books, and I'm very proud of that. Now, by far, the premier and most prestigious club or society actually in the entire world, not just in the United States, is the Miniature Book Society. They provide a full-color newsletter and an international gathering once a year called a conclave. Many years ago, I hosted a conclave at Charlottesville, Virginia. I was very proud to do that, and I also was a former editor. Now, I have to be totally honest with you. I am no longer a member of the Miniature Book Society, but I wholeheartedly support their efforts. And it is a wonderful organization. People's positions change often, so it's best to visit their very beautiful website and go up to join and membership, and that will tell you who is the current membership person and the address that you can join the Miniature Book Society. And I do highly recommend that you do that. It's a good organization, and one of the most enjoyable things are their conclaves. At the end of each episode, I plan to answer the how of miniature books. How do I get them? Well, you can't. I bought them all. No, that's not true. To assist in this, I will highlight two businesses each episode who sell miniature books. This episode, I'm highlighting two brick and mortar businesses who have long histories with miniature books. The first is Oak Knoll, in a very historic old red brick building, but the real treasures are inside. The miniature books are easily accessible and available to pick up and inspect, something that other smaller booksellers just don't do. Many have them in drawers and in back rooms, but Oak Knoll places the miniature books next to some of the finest editions. This is the manager and owner of Oak Knoll, Rob Fleck. Rob is one of my favorite people. You can buy the miniature books online by going to Oak Knoll, AKKNOLL.com. And I really enjoy this site for many, many reasons. And here's one of them, as they say in commercials, but wait, there's more. Oak Knoll is a bibliophile's paradise. They're more than a bookstore. They also publish some of the best and finest books on books in the world. Be sure to look through, if you go to the website, book collecting, book design, book binding, fine press books, and their newly published book section. And this highlights the very limited press run books, some of them as limited as 100 books. And on a personal note, I have to tell you that one of my favorite books and an absolute must have for any book collector is the ABC for book collectors. Oak Knoll is only open Monday through Friday, but you can contact them to see about a Saturday visit. Now, if you fly up the eastern coast a little ways from Delaware, you run into the historic city of Boston. I love the lobster rolls and all of the thrilling history, but a visit to Boston is never complete for me without a stop at Bromer's Books at 607 Boylston Street. Now, I know this building looks like it's falling over, but it's the best shot that I could find. Anne and David Bromer are the owners of Bromer's Books, and several years ago they brought in a manager, Phil Salmon. All of these people are highly educated in all things about books. Anne Bromer co-wrote the miniature books with Julian Edison. The showroom at Bromer's includes miniature books and some of the finest books a bibliophile would want. They do have an online catalog or book catalog. They added the price, and this is one thing that I really like. They add the price of shipping after you have bought the book. So the shipping matches the size and weight of the book you buy, and miniature books are the lightest one, so you don't pay as much. All right, there we have it. We talked about the what, we talked about the when, and we talked a little bit about the how. So I really appreciate you coming and spending a little time with me. And I hope to see you on our next adventure in miniature books when we look into the other questions: how, who, why, how, all those things. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.
Watch out for snakes.